Welcome to episode 20 of the Imagine Your Future podcast. I'm Steve Hall, and I'm joined by my co-host and colleague, Karen Collyer. Our aim with this podcast is to inform, educate, and engage our listeners on technology and digital-related topics. Karen, how about you introduce yourself to the audience?
Thanks, Steve. I'm super excited to be joining the ISG podcasting family, and I can't wait to get started. As you know, I've been with the organization almost as long as you have, 13 years in my case, and I've been in the tech space for over 20 years. And in that time, it feels like I've done a little bit of everything. But lately, I've been focused on transformation management, both internally at ISG and with some of our clients. It's, I think, relevant because in this episode, we're honored to have Nitin Rakesh, the CEO of Mphasis and co-author of a new book, Transformation in Time of Crisis, which was co-authored with Jerry Wynn.
Great. Thanks, Karen. I'm so excited to have us, co-lead this as we go forward. So Nitin's been a close friend and colleague of mine for a number of years. He's currently the CEO of Mphasis, a large technology firm focused on helping clients transform their operations. Nitin's been in the CEO role now for 4 years, where he's accelerated the growth and broke through the $1 billion a year revenue mark. Nitin's also on several boards, including the U.S.-India Strategic Partnership Forum, the Wall Street Journal CEO Council, and a member of the advisory board at Wharton School of Business. Nitin was previously the CEO of Syntel, a global technology firm that was recently acquired by Atos. So welcome, Nitin, and tell us a little bit about your background.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Karen, for having me. I'm really excited, really appreciate the opportunity to speak to your audience and really, amazing work that you guys are doing, both at ISG and, of course, with the podcast series. And a quick background, of course, as you mentioned, I've been in the technology services business, for a better part of my career. I've also spent a reasonable amount of time in financial services on the business side. I was the founder CEO of an asset management company, back in 2008 timeframe. But at heart, I'm a geek. I love the world of software. I think clearly something that every business is waking up to. That every business is really pivoting really sharply, behind a number of trends, and one of them definitely continues to be rapid and massive adoption of all things technology. Especially digital tech and customer engagement. So I'm really evangelistic about applying technology to every business to transform not just the way they interact with their customers, but most importantly, the way they run their own business operations. And how can you actually make them more efficient, and most importantly, embrace all the new, wonderful technology that's come out, especially over the last 10 years, and really, pivot the business to become a much better business. So I think that's my passion. I'm also passionate about the business of business. So I'm always interested in looking around and seeing how many new businesses are mushrooming, both from digital vanguard businesses, and of course, how more traditional enterprises that have been around for 100 plus years are also actually embracing the change and moving forward. So I'm a real keen student of what's going on in the world of business.
Very cool, Nitin. So, I'm always fascinated with, senior execs and their journey to where they got to they are. And you've had multiple CEO roles and really grown in the space. Give us a little sense about your own personal journey.
Sure. Again, Steve, thanks for that question. It's a little bit awkward to talk about yourself and your journey, but, I grew up in a small town outside of Delhi. I was probably one of the fortunate ones that, right at middle school, I was pretty convinced that I wanted to be an engineer. And right after I started to get fascinated with what back then they used to call personal computers. So I ended up in engineering school, graduated as a software engineer and spent some time working for a software services firm that was actually at that point in time one of India's largest firms, and had a number of turnkey projects from the government. And I worked on a super secret project back then, which was with the Department of Defense. Continued to get fascinated, but I decided that I want to get a broader perspective. And I think I mentioned to you I was really fascinated by the world of business. So I ended up getting an MBA. I graduated from business school, went into the world of financial services, mostly on the asset management buy side, and that really opened up a whole new world for me, because it's important to understand how the world works from a business standpoint, right? Both from a macroeconomic standpoint, trade and economics, but more importantly, all the levers that business execs have at their disposal when it comes to actually operating a business, both from a growth standpoint and of course from a profitability standpoint. So I think that was a big education in the management of any business. And when you start as an analyst in a financial services firm, you really get a chance to see many different companies in many different sectors. And in a number of ways, I think I got a little bit of global exposure through that experience as well. But I very quickly came back to the business of technology. And really, I think I was fortunate to work under some amazing leaders in some great companies through my career. And of course, I ended up building the State Street Intel joint venture, which was a great way to learn deep insights about the operations of a large global US bank. And that I think was I would say a turning point in my career. And really, I was fortunate enough to continue to do what I love to do, and ended up as CEO of Syntel. Clearly grew from within, and really I'm grateful for all the leaders and my ex bosses and mentors. And of course, the last 4 years have been an amazing journey. As we bought Mphasis in partnership with Blackstone, we spun the company off HP. Reestablished the brand, pretty much started from scratch, because the firm was in the shadow of big IT for almost 10 years, first EDS and then HP. And both great firms, great shareholders of the business. But in the end, I think, spinning out the business, reestablishing the brand, and really doubling down on, few bets that we made on where our clients needed the most help, has really helped us unlock a lot of value within our company, within our employees, and all our stakeholders. So it's been a fantastic journey last 4 years, especially as we've seen the business grow, fairly healthily, and of course, I'm a big believer that you do well only when your clients vote for you with their dollars, and I think that's what we've been seeing last 4 years.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Nitin. I know this first question is always tough because it's such a well-connected industry, which is what I love about it. And as you know, I grew up in a really small town in Illinois as well. Always wanted to be an astronaut. Quickly realized that there was only about 15 astronauts at the time and 400,000 engineers. So I thought being an engineer was a better route to go as well. And my passion and love for technology that led me to the Air Force and to the Department of Defense, doing top secret projects as well, which was fascinating. But Karen, I know you've got, you're, being Canadian and everything, you've got an interesting background as well. You want to give us a little hint?
I do. So my technology background came by way of a master's degree in literature and contemporary critical theory. So when I came out of school, I was like, well, what can I do with that? And I started as an actual technical writer for an SAP services firm. I quickly left the English, the grammar, the tech writing behind and dove headfirst into technology. But I still have a love of books, which is why I'm super excited to be talking to Nitin today, and really focusing on your book, Transformation in Times of Crisis. And I'm going to read the subtitle, 8 Principles for Creating Opportunities and Value in the Post-Pandemic World. And my first question related to your book is really, what was your inspiration?
Karen, that's a great question because there's a little backstory, like there always is, especially when you undertake a project that, at least in my case, was my maiden effort at actually writing a book. Jerry and I got together a couple of years ago and hosted a set of very senior execs from our client base at the Wharton School of Business. And the topic of that workshop was architecture of disruption. And the thinking was, how do traditional businesses, and by traditional businesses, I mean enterprises that have been around for longer than the internet revolution, right? Basically anybody who predates 90s, given that, some of the world's biggest companies today were born in that era, they're probably in a little bit of a different context. But if you look at traditional businesses, almost all of them had been struggling with this onslaught from digital vanguards and upstarts. And you go industry by industry, you start seeing, the trends. Of course, we now know well about what happened to the retail industry post the entry of Amazon, and continues to be the trend, especially with physical retail stores. And it went from physical retail to e-commerce to omni-channel to digital. And now it's really all about digital, presence in that world. Same thing happened in the payments industry, with the emergence of PayPal and then Square and then Stripe versus, a number of the traditional established players on the credit card side or on the payment side. We've seen the same thing happen in media with Netflix and the traditional media companies, especially, going all the way to Hollywood. So we already could see that the number of trends were building up, and the workshop topic was basically how do you deal with this disruption, and are there things you can do to kind of pivot your business model, embrace technology a lot deeper, rethink the way you run your business, get more customer centricity in there. Instead of running the business back office first, can you actually run it client first? And that's how we kind of stumbled on this conceptual framework that we now call front to back.
Mm-hmm.
And Jerry was very insistent. He after the workshop he actually called me and said, "I really like what we did in the workshop. You should think about writing a paper based on what we saw in the workshop, because we had some amazing companies in there too." And very quickly he actually said, no, why don't you start writing a book about it? And I'm like, Jerry, I haven't never written a book. So he convinced me to write a book. He said he'll partner with me, he'll teach me, he'll be my mentor. And so we started writing a book about a year and a half ago about the same concepts. How do you embrace technology? How do you deal with disruption? And then we were probably, I would say, in the final innings of our book. We didn't quite have our first manuscript yet, but we were pretty far down the road and COVID hit. And so we took a pause and we realized that we have to practice what we were preaching. We had to actually pivot the book itself. So the book went through its own transformation because we realized two things. One, there were a number of trends that we were talking about that were anyways getting accelerated due to COVID, right? Think about e-commerce penetration in retail doubling in 3 months. What took 16 years happened in 3 months. What took 20 years for telemedicine, quadrupled in 30 days. Every industry went through its own COVID moment and the major acceleration. In a way, I was reminded of the book Tipping Point, if you've read it, where actually they use the example of a pandemic to substantiate when a tipping point is hit. So we actually pivoted the book and effectively rewrote large parts of it to create what you now see, the 8 principles that we thought people could use, because every opportunity and crisis are the two sides of the same coin. While there is a crisis, there's also a massive opportunity for businesses to use this crisis to springboard the change, leapfrog a few generations or a few segments that they were going to think about. If it was to be done in 10 years, can you do it in 3 years? If you had internal change resistance, can you actually then break through that change barrier, because now consumer is demanding this? So that's kind of a little bit of the backstory of the book.
And how long did it take to research? Because it is so well researched.
Thank you. Now, as I mentioned, right, the very first realization, we'd been at it for about 18 months before the crisis hit, but the very first realization in March, April of last year was that, in a sense, we were not seeing any new major trends. The context was new because people were locked down and there was a health crisis, but the underlying trends were not new. So a lot of the research that we've been doing over the last 2 years was actually very helpful. A lot of the case studies we talked about, we had to augment them. But in a way, we were very clear that this isn't going to be a set of principles without any practice examples. So we were very focused on substantiating almost every principle with as many real life case studies as we could. And we probably, if you see one of the last case studies in the book is about Pfizer and the bold leadership that the Pfizer CEO displayed as they decided to actually start building the vaccine 6 months before they got the approval.
As I was reading the book, the thing that struck me was how close it was to Good to Great. And I think what Jim Collins did was Good to Great was really just a fascinating read and clearly one of the best books of our generation on business leadership. And the way that he laid out the core concepts and told the stories behind it and did so much research, as Karen just highlighted, I kept kind of flashing back to that as sort of an inspiration as well. But, I think when you think about Good to Great, you think about the hedgehog concepts, you think about getting the right person on the right bus in the right seat. You really kind of lay out those things that are so critical. I feel like the 8 principles that you've laid out as well are going to be sort of long lasting like that. Can you just give us a sense of sort of the principles in the book and how you sort of relate to them today?
Absolutely, Steve. First of all, thank you very much. Good to Great is It's definitely an all-time classic for any student of business, and also one of my top favorite books. In fact, not too long ago, I reread the book, and then I actually gave one of our sales meet talks was around the book, and I actually ended up with a quote that said, "Good is also the enemy of great." So how do you really make sure that you don't get stuck in that concept? So I'm really delighted and humbled by your comparison to it. I think so there was definitely, I would say, a subconscious inspiration that probably shone through. The first thing about the principles is, the first principle really is the foundation of the start of everything when it comes to transformation. And as we talk about shifting your mental models, I think what we're really saying is that you have to change the old ways of thinking, because think about it, if you thought that the crisis would be over in 3 months or 6 months and we go back to life as it used to be before, I think that's not going to happen. And now it's very evident it's not going to happen, but it probably wasn't that evident back in March or April last year. So how do you really use the current situation to speed up those changes and break down the resistance to change, especially when the old ways will continue to generate cash, right? And that's really where that whole classical concept of, you become a victim of your own success. You have this cash cow mindset. It's very, very hard to cannibalize a business that generates a lot of cash. So I think the first principle really is the foundation and the bedrock of everything else. Because if you can't get past that first hurdle, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to actually embrace, any transformation, any change. And the final thing I'll say about that principle is that that change starts at the top of the house, and typically is, I would say, a leader's responsibility to actually embrace that and then find the courage to drive that through the organization. And there are examples abound, right? Microsoft's a great example of how we saw them embracing the change, with the new leadership, and I think what they've managed to pull off in the last 5 or 6 years is probably one of the greatest stories of a massive pivot at a massive scale. And you wouldn't have imagined that there would be a day where Microsoft would be buying GitHub because they embraced open source. I mean, that's the exact antithesis of what you had thought Microsoft to be 30 years ago, right? But that's the level of change and the commitment at the top that we saw with the shift in the mental model. And I think from that, you then start thinking about every stakeholder. The second principle talks about, approach to stakeholders and customers. And we are differentiating stakeholders from shareholders. We're talking about the broader impact to all stakeholders, employees, customers, shareholders, and of course, society. And I think the key thinking there is, it's an age-old concept of, know your customer. Customer is king. We say all of these things, but how well do you really know your customer? Especially if you're an established traditional enterprise, do you really know your customer to a point that you can predict their needs, or you can actually start personalizing their experiences? Because customers' loyalty is no longer to a brand; it's actually pivoted to experience and ease of doing business, and the delight that you get with that. And there are examples abound, and I think that's why you think about Amazon being customer obsessed. You think about Netflix actually knowing you to a point that they create content knowing who's going to watch it. You don't have to search far and long. I mean, those are great examples of customer and stakeholder management and engagement and reinventing the approach. And then from then on, we talk about how do you speed up digital transformation? How do you use tech to drive that personalization that I talked about? And then I think you start thinking about, if I have to make these changes in my organization, what else do I need? Right? I need the right talent. I need the ability to think about, bring not just hiring the talent in the org, but maybe tapping them, into an open talent mindset. I need innovation inside and outside. I need to think about, how do I innovate across multiple horizons? I may not know what will be out 3 years from now, be the next big thing, but do I really can I put a stake on the ground and start seeding it? I mean, if you think about things like Bitcoin or blockchain, 3 years ago they were early trends. Today they are mainstream. If similarly, if you think about quantum computing, it's fashionable right now, but probably be mainstream in 2 to 3 years from now. So how do you really make sure that you're investing across horizons? And finally, how do you actually bring it all together? You bring it all together. What's the org design you need for it? How do you create your organization architecture? How do you play into the network effect? Because this is an ecosystem play, and in our industry, very well. Ecosystem consists of hyperscale cloud providers, software products, security companies, services companies, and so on. So I think, how do you kind of play with that ecosystem? So, and most importantly, none of these principles in themselves are adequate. They have to be, embraced, hand in hand. But one of the most important ones is the first principle, which is the mental models.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to come back. If you hadn't circled back to this, I was going to. Changing your mental model is really hard to do, and I think it sets up the discussion kind of for the rest of the book. Even though we all talk about transformation all the time, what techniques did you observe that have helped executives really change their models?
So, Karen, that's a really insightful question on two fronts. Firstly, I think it starts with intent, and once you have the intent, it then starts with practice, and both of those are required for this change and shift to happen. And I think I saw, at least in the last 5 or 7 years, since we've seen the acceleration of these trends, and especially in the last 12 months, I think I've seen both of those play out really well, both the intent and the commitment and the practice of that intent. And I think what works really well is a deep realization that going back to the old ways is not an option. There is this old British term that, Steve, you probably have heard, in your time in England. It's called burn the bridges. If you don't really have the option of going back to where you came from, you would then go wholeheartedly into the change that you're trying to drive. But if you always keep an eye on the option of going back to your old ways, we will never make that shift happen. And that's why, this concept of cannibalizing, what really is working today for sake of what will actually work, few years out, is a very difficult chasm to cross. Now, think about companies that sacrificed immediate chunky license revenue because they were starting to sell subscription. We have a great example in companies like Adobe. That takes courage, because you're basically telling your stakeholders that you will actually be reducing your short-term revenue, short-term profits, because you think that the business model is shifting away into a subscription mindset. And that's a very hard change to make. But I think that, again, I go back to the point, it starts at the top. Us CEOs have that responsibility of driving that change. If we don't embrace that change, this is not a change that will come bottoms up.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. And I think that is so critical. As I read it, there was a number of principles that just really resonated with me. I think of all of them, though, Principle 4 was really my favorite, because I think it really got to the core issue. And that is, it's really all about talent in today's world, whether it's the executive talent or talent throughout the organization. And I love your conversation around how do you reinvent your talent strategy? What's the evolution of open talent? How do you think about a broader strategy for talent? But, I don't think broadly governments around the world and even enterprises have fully understood or ready to embrace sort of open talent and different ways of seeing that. How do you see that evolving, and what do you see the role, of both enterprises and governments to make this a real priority?
Yeah, Steve, actually, I'm going to push back a little bit, because if you look at an organization as secretive and strategic as NASA, they have been embracing open talent and open innovation for a better part of the last 50 years. The actual number of people who work at NASA versus the actual number of people who contribute to NASA programs is an order of magnitude different. There's almost 1 million people that are connected to the NASA innovation programs through hackathons and challenges that NASA throws up quite often. Now, they may not bring those people inside the tent in terms of, their security clearances or their ability to actually participate in actual space programs. But every time they hit a hurdle, they have the ability to open up that problem to a broader, group of people, and in a way kind of crowdsource innovation. And I'm just giving you one example of a company that we would never imagine, or an organization that we would never imagine would go down that road because of the nature of what they do. So I think, again, it is a little bit about the mental model. And I think we are starting to see that openness, with traditional enterprises. We are starting to see that I have seen many, C-suite folks tell me that, we are a bank. We are never going to be able to attract Google-like engineers or Amazon-like engineers. So how are we going to compete if they get into financial services? And my answer to them always is, well, there's always the ability to bring people on, either by using, strategic partners, or in many cases, nothing stops you from opening up your talent process or innovation process. I think, it is a little bit of a mental model issue. I have seen more progress in this Uberization of workforce mindset or the gig economy for talent in the last 2 years than I've seen in the previous 10. So I think it's beginning to gain pace. Some of it is necessity, requires that that change. And some of it clearly is I think a little bit more openness and the shift that we've seen in the last 12 months at least in embracing some of these models. And I think, of course, that definitely goes back to the root of how can you drive transformation without having the right talent. And to me, I think that's an inevitable way forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good perspective. And the NASA example that you had in the book was spot on. I think there are challenges with, whether it's capability maturity models and process controls and other things that, people in procurement and software companies think they have to have. But you're absolutely right. We've got to get over that and change our mental models as we go forward.
I think, as the NASA example demonstrates, you can still keep all those controls and governance in place while not making that a constraint for you to be able to access talent for problems that you really need that talent for.
Can we move on to principle number 7,
Sure.
which was redrawing your timelines and building a portfolio of initiatives across the innovation horizons? I'm not sure that all of our listeners are going to know what is an innovation horizon. So could we start there? And
Sure.
Then once we talk about that, how does an organization deal with dynamic versus static horizons, and how do enterprises make the shift? Those are the questions I have here.
Sure, Karen. So I think let me first start by talking about what innovation horizons mean. I think if you zoom out a little bit, this is the classical construct of short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And those are think about those three as the three horizons, not just for innovation, but for any business and for any business to make bets in, right? When we do a business strategy exercise, we think about here and now, today, what am I doing? How do I make my numbers for this quarter? How do I make my plan for this year? All of that must sit in horizon 1 because that's what you're executing on today. It could be expansion in geographies, it could be technologies, it could be industries that you operate in, it could be adjacencies that you want to get into. So that's like today and here and now, right? And then you think about horizon 3 being, and again, I'm going to go on the other extreme. Horizon 3 is something that you have a sense that you want to invest in. The market isn't quite ready for it yet. You are not quite ready to go into that market yet because you don't have the resources, you haven't done enough work. You need to kind of seed those ideas. So think of horizon 3 as seeding new programs that will become horizon 1, in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, depending on how quickly your industry moves. If you're in the semiconductor business, horizon 1 to 3 will probably be only 12 months apart or 18 months apart because remember Moore's law.
Yeah.
If you're in in the healthcare business, they could probably be 3 years or 5 years apart. So I think it depends on the industry you operate in, but that's essentially the concept of horizons. The advice we are giving in chapter 7, where we talk about building a portfolio of initiatives across all innovation horizons, really is to make sure that you always have some investment allocated to longer term, horizon programs, because what may not seem important today will suddenly become important given the fact that we are seeing a major acceleration in the pace of change. And I think I gave examples from our own industry, a few minutes ago. Mphasis just invested about 6 months ago, 9 months ago, into building a quantum computing lab. Now, you can ask me, but how many of your clients are today on the quantum computer or even embracing the quantum capabilities of AWS or Azure? And the answer is maybe one. But I think we made a bet that that's an area where we will see dramatic investment go in by not just our clients, but actually the ecosystem. And there are problems that you will be able to solve that you're probably not able to solve today. There are difficult problems that require compute. Optimization of networks is one example of that, right? For e-commerce, and airline scheduling is another example. Those are suboptimally done today, but there's a need for those things to be applied to. If you think of the Google Moonshot Factory, that's a Horizon 3 innovation investment that they made, right? Now you have many ideas, not all of them will fructify, and then you define what's the process by which you will measure the success. That's a very individual decision for a business company, but drones is a good example, right? Drones investments have been made for the last 10, 12, 15 years, and maybe even longer. And now we know what drones will mean to the future of mobility, not just in e-commerce, but actually individual mobility as well, right? There was an announcement this morning of a SPAC, buying out a personal mobility, drone business. So I think it's here and now. Drones are more like Horizon 1 today for those industries, but they were not so 5 years or 7 years ago. So I think that's the concept that we're talking about.
Yeah, that is so cool. I think, Nitin, the other key thing, and it's really along the same lines, I think you just nailed. What's the message to senior execs and CEOs when they think about the level of innovation, but cannibalizing your own business? And for public companies, how do you really reconcile that with sort of the street and the pressure that so many CEOs are under for, quarterly returns?
Steve, that's probably one of the most difficult jobs as a public company CEO is to balance the short term with the long term. And I think I've said that probably as my number one challenge, in a public company CEO role. Now, there are two aspects around it. Firstly, I think the stakeholders, the shareholders expect transparency and honesty. And if you give them the transparency and the honesty, it is possible for you to actually create a transformation plan. But then you have to hold yourself accountable and you have to report to that plan. So I think that's the yin and the yang that goes with it, right? If you do not embrace the change, you can definitely optimize for a short term. But at some point when the change does hit, you really will have a much bigger problem because you will see parts of your business disappear. We've seen that in our industry, Steve. You remember 5-7 years ago, we used to have large service lines around testing and production support and infrastructure management, right? If you didn't embrace those changes in our industry, and really started building for everything as a service or the mass migration to public cloud, we would not really have large parts of our business to disappear, and we would not have any growth left. And we are seeing that in our industry. There are certain companies that are struggling to find growth, and in fact are declining businesses. Why? Because they really were not able to make that pivot because they didn't want to invest for that long-term view because they were optimizing short-term quarters. So I think, and again, I gave you the Adobe example, a great example of how when you communicate a strategy and you lay out a 5-year vision, you can actually embrace it and turn, and show that strategy is possible, right? Microsoft is a great example again. So I think it's about having an open, honest conversation with your stakeholders, putting out a plan, and defining some targets, goalposts, and holding yourself accountable and report to those.
From a transformation program perspective, what if, and I know you say this a number of times in the book, that, organizations should strive to do all 8 principles simultaneously, but what if for whatever reason they can't? It's leadership, it's money, it's talent. If you only had to pick 3 to focus on, what would the 3 be?
That's a tough one, Karen, because as I mentioned, right, you have to be able to, you can always sequence out a number of these things. You don't have to start with a plan that says, let's create a plan that has these 8 principles and certain weightages. I think we give a little bit of a flavor of that in the last chapter where we talk about, the toolkits and frameworks, then you can measure your own progress. So you can definitely prioritize. I would say it doesn't matter how much money, time, energy, or resources you have. You start with principle 1, and then you go from there.
Okay, I can't say that surprises me because principle 1 kept coming up again and again and again, right? Changing that mental model.
It is the foundation. It is the foundation. It is where it all starts.
It is. I was really going to ask a similar question and double down on Karen's a little bit and really say, with the exception of principle 1, which is really change your mental model and mindset, which I think we all have to do, just given not just COVID, the pandemic, but just what digital transformation means. If you had to say, though, Nitin, so I'm going to make you think hard on this one, which principle should we always be doing, regardless of the pandemic or anything else? If you had to say one,
yes, absolutely,
or a senior exec, which one should we just always be thinking of?
So Steve, if you think about what we are saying in right after that principle, we are really quickly moving on to customers and stakeholders. If you keep an eye on customers and stakeholders, you will rarely go wrong. But I'm going to challenge every enterprise, not just to say that we are a customer-centric company, but to really define what it means and do an honest assessment of how well do you really know your customer. Right? Just because you stopped sending them a physical mailer and you send them an email or a digital ad doesn't make you a digital business. Do you really know exactly each consumer's profile to a point that you can predict what their next need will be from you? You may decide either to offer it proactively or to customize it or to tailor it when they approach you, but do you really have that level of insight on your consumer? So I think to me, that's one big category. And if you see there are 3 or 4 principles that go with that with that theme, right? Principle number 2, number 3, number 5, they're all in that theme of what can you do to be agile, nimble, and customer focused. And the second one obviously is, your internals, right? Talent, and how do you really, innovation is a very broad word. We talked about horizons. The beauty about horizons is that they're dynamic, they're not static. What you may think of horizon 1, 2, and 3 today will change, is likely to change maybe in 3 months, maybe in 6 months, right? So how do you really, operate your internals to a point that you're then set up so you don't fall behind with, your competitors or your client expectations? So I think I would say, if you think of it, from a little bit broader perspective, those are the 2 broad categories outside of principle 1.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the second one is actually just as critical. I think we should always know our clients, but really understanding what our own assets are and who we are as a firm or organization is just absolutely critical. I always kind of reflect back on John Deere, a 150-year-old tractor company. Arguably, you'd say that tractors were their core asset, right? But what you quickly realize is really their core asset is that the tractors are on thousands and thousands of acres of farmland throughout the U.S. And thinking about sensors and soil and drones and sort of using that as the asset, you start really redefining your business. So I think it's really about, what's the data? What are the streams that you have? What value streams do you support? And truly, what are those assets that you bring? And how does that fit within that overall value stream? Stepping back and looking at that really opens up new ways of thinking as well.
Absolutely.
Well, Nitin, this has been absolutely fantastic. I can't believe how fast the time flies with this. Any closing comments or anything else from you?
I would only say, a couple of things in closing, Steve and Karen. Firstly, thank you all, so much for hosting this. Of course, as you can see, and I'm a little bit of an evangelist when it comes to embracing change. But I think I don't want to also come across as believing that this is easy. This is hard work. This is, in many cases, nerve-wracking because, organizations are complex creatures. There are many moving parts. There are many different stakeholders, and there are many different ways to get to the same outcome. So I think in the end, I cannot overemphasize the courage that it takes to make something like this work, especially with the leadership of the companies. And of course, I'm most empathetic about that aspect, and I want call that out because in the end, it takes courageous leadership to do this. And I think the final thing I will say is, we have a chapter in the book, right after the introduction called Call to Action. Not embracing change is not an imperative because it can actually be an existential issue if you don't do it. So I think those will be my 2 final comments.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. So we can't thank you, Nitin, enough for joining us on our episode of Imagine Your Future. For our listeners, we will be including a link to the book, Transformation in Times of Crisis, in our socials and on the ISG website. So go do yourself a gigantic favor and go read it. And on behalf of the team here, thanks for lending us your ears. Be on the lookout for our next episode coming to a podcast app near you. And don't forget to rate us.